Thank you for watching this video. Today we're going to talk about TM1 or Planning Analytics security. So I've got a number of questions about how to manage security for a TM1 or Planning Analytics solution. So I want to talk through some of the design concepts around security and how you should be thinking about security when you're going to maintain it and implement it. So for security, you want to make sure you're considering the user and group design. So there's the user group design and the security layer. So we'll talk about user group design first. So let's imagine we have to figure out, well, what groups do we want to have. Here we have a set of groups where we have TM1 user is a group made up of our user Greg and our group managers. Managers are made up of our user Sally and our group VP. And VP is made up of our group, our user Jeff and our group administrator, and then administrator only has one user named Bob. So as you follow this membership, think about it from right to left. So Bob is an administrator. Administrators and Jeff can see what VPs can see. VPs and Sally can see what managers see. Managers and Greg can see what TM1 users see. So the first step before we can get into tailoring anything is we need to make sure we have a clear tree of our users and groups and membership. So note here we're using groups can be members of other groups. Ideally, you only really want to have a user show up once and then use group membership to cascade the other membership. So even though Bob is only a group member of the group administrator, because of this cascading relationship, Bob as an administrator can see everything that a VP, a manager, or a TM1 user can see. So down the road, if we say we want to add in another user named Megan, we can just add Megan as an administrator, and then Megan automatically gets everything, access to all the items for which her group membership gives her permission. So assume we have those groups figured out. Now we have to think about the security layers for which we have in TM1. So I'll kind of give an overview first and then we'll look at them in turn. So we have capabilities. Capabilities are really specific features that someone can access. Access to Server Explorer. So Server Explorer is the tool that lets folks see what cubes, dimensions, views, processes they have access to. Are they able to see that Server Explorer tool? You can turn that on or off. The personal workspace write-back mode. So along with sandboxing, these two are very similar tools. Sandboxing lets an individual user create a sandbox. A sandbox is available to everyone in across the system. Now a personal workspace is only it's exactly like a sandbox, but it's only visible to the individual user and it cannot be shared across other users. Managing data reservation and data reservation override. This has to do with, can this person reserve a cube and can they override someone else that is reserved if they have sufficient permission to do so. Typically I leave these ones off. These are more advanced features that I would think really shouldn't be used in most cases. Consolidation, type-in, spreading. So this is the idea that maybe you're doing a forecast and you want to put in a high-level number for revenue for a given period. Even though there's hundreds of accounts below revenue, you want to be able to type in revenue at the very top level and say, $1 million. And when you type that number in, it'll automatically spread that to all the leaves below that revenue number. Now, this feature is good in the sense that it lets folks do high-level forecasting very easily. It's challenging in the sense that it just spreads that data evenly across all the leaves. So if folks were to look at an individual account, an individual revenue account within that forecast, it would look really silly. It'd look like garbage data because all the accounts would have the same number, just totaling up to that $1 million top-level revenue number. Spreading is another feature. So spreading is the ability to let folks spread. Let's use the example of revenue again. So if we wanted to let folks spread that revenue number, rather than just typing it in, we can allow them to spread. So they right click on a cell, they select the spreading method. So they say maybe they want it to repeat at the leaves, maybe they want to use a proportional spread, maybe they want to use a relative proportional spread to look back at a prior year, to spread it the same way it was done in a prior year. But with allow spreading, they can do the spreading, but they need to pick their method. With the consolidation type in spreading, they can just type in a number and it'll automatically do repeat leaves spreading item. So these are the capabilities that are really features you can turn on and off for specific user groups. Actually, I should qualify it by saying, as we go forward, all of these items here are really done by groups. So TM1 does, I'll use TM1 or Planning Analytics there, you can use those interchangeably. When it comes to security, permissions are granted to groups. So even if it's a group of one person, you need to have a group to which you can give permission. There's also interoperability with other security providers. So maybe you have Active Directory, maybe you have some kind of an LDAP provider, maybe or some kind of another user management or identity management system that you're already using. You can plug into those things and use those as your authentication providers. It's very common to see single sign-on where someone's going to log in with their same network credentials and they want to use those here. That's fine. We can set that piece up. But then that also gives you the ability to set up groups in that other system. So if I use Active Directory as an example, maybe we set up all of our groups and all of our membership in Active Directory, and those just flow in here. They flow here into TM1, and we set permissions in TM1 relative to each of those Active Directory groups. So that's beneficial in the sense that we just set the permissions once inside TM1, and then you manage membership outside of the system. So as users come and go from different groups, their permissions are automatically updated. And a question I commonly get is, well, when does that happen? Do I need to run a process nightly? When does that security get refreshed? Each time a user logs in, if they're connecting through an authentication provider, let's say Active Directory, when they log in, they're authenticated to that provider. It also updates their membership. So if the first time someone logs in, if they're a member of 6 groups that are already defined with security in the system, they will be marked as a member of all those 6 groups. Later on, if they're in Active Directory, if their membership is updated, they're removed from those 6 groups. The next time they log in, they will be removed from those 6 groups and they will lose that access. So we've talked about user and group design, we've talked about capabilities. Now let's get into the security layers. At a high level, there's application, cubes, dimensions, and processes. We'll look at them in a tool in a moment, but for applications, think of applications as the menu folders or items. And for a menu folder or item, you can set it to read, write, or none. So read meaning they can see this menu item. It could be a folder, or it could be a specific report or template. They can write. This is typically for a folder. So maybe they're allowed to publish new templates or reports into this folder. That's the write access. None. They don't see this thing. So whether it's a menu item or a folder, if a user group just has none, they don't see the thing. The item still exists, but they don't have the privilege to see it. Cubes. So typically, cube security is related to the data points. So this is what specific data can someone be looking at or interacting with. We can set up security cubes to provide a little bit easier management. In a typical case of a planning scenario, you're going to have scenario, year, period. Those are things you really want to control. So maybe your budget for the whole year is open, and then as the whole year you lock it down. But for actuals, they're closed the whole year, and maybe they're just opened for specific periods when you're loading data. And similarly, maybe when you're doing a forecast, only certain periods are opened for forecast in a given year, for which folks can write data to, and then once that's closed, it can be locked, so that no end user can make changes past that point. you can get very specific within a cube, and this is called cell level security. This is the ability to say very specifically, this one user group can see this combination of a scenario, period, a year, or any kind of combination of dimensions within a single cube. I don't recommend using that. It does hit performance, and it's difficult to maintain. If there's a need for some kind of a control, I recommend implementing security cubes approach, where there's a tool where some administrator can go in and say, these ones are open, these ones are closed. And then behind the scenes, there's a little save process that will update security cubes as needed. Also dimensions. So think of dimensions as really the object. Can they see the dimension? And also the elements in a dimension. So maybe you've got an entity dimension with a number of different business units in it. So can they see this dimension? Typically, yes. This would be, you'd want to turn this off if maybe you've got HR data along with your finance data along with your operations data. Maybe if there's certain dimensions that only make sense to HR, well, only the HR team can see those things, and the folks in finance and operations, they cannot even see those, employee dimensions. What's a more common case is folks can see all the dimensions, but you set element security to say they can only see specific ones in a dimension. So to go back and use our entity example, so if we have an entity dimension with 6 different business units in it, we can control which group gets to see which of those entities. So if you have a VP, the VP can see everything that the manager below them can see, maybe a little bit more. And if you have a administrator, they can see everything. Then lastly is processes. So processes we can control with really read or none. And that just lets folks lets a user group run a specific process. So let's take a look at what this looks like in practice. So here we are, we're logged into Architect. We're going to use a planning sample TM1 instance. This is a sample that's available when you install TM1. If you don't have it, you can just rerun your install and you'll be able to install the samples there. If I right click on the instance, I'll see capability assignments as one of the menus here. Capability assignments lets us define, by group, all the different features. And notice you can say grant or deny or none. So you may have a number of users that are part of multiple groups, and if there's someone that's part of a specific group, you want to set deny access to that. So that will deny means that even if they have access somewhere through some other group, deny says nope, they can't do it. But grant lets them do it. None just means no, they don't have any access. They won't be able to use the feature, but they won't be prevented from they won't be able to use the feature. So that's just capability assignments. Next, we look at applications. So we right click on applications. You can create a new application. This is just really the folder structures and menu items that you see below here. And if I look at any given one, I can right click on it, and with the security menu I can select security assignments. And here where I'm looking at groups along the top, the 3 admin groups, you'll commonly see admin, data admin, security admin. These are groups that cannot be changed. These are system level groups that people can be set as, they can be members of this group, but you can't delete these groups. The user groups are these ones over on the right. They have the header user groups, and if I scroll all the way to the right, you'll see here we have budget process admin, budget reviewer, budget viewer, marketing, and sales. And when I look at the access privileges, I can choose between none, read, and admin. Reserve, lock, and write aren't available here. We're just deciding whether an individual group has no access, meaning they can't see anything. They can read this thing, meaning they can really run the report, and admin. I misspoke before. It's really admin is the last state here rather than write, and admin lets them publish to that particular folder or overwrite an existing report or template. So that's applications. If I look at cubes, if I right click on cubes and I say cube assignments, I'm going to get a listing of the cubes down my rows. I can control logging. I recommend on really large cubes you may want to turn logging off, but if you have the resources to do so, logging is a very powerful feature to leave on. And here we can control for a given cube, for a different group. So right now for my budget viewer group, they have write access to all of these different cubes. Maybe my budget viewer shouldn't have access to the control cube. So for the control cube, I'm going to say none. So maybe they have no access to that cube now. But for the report cube, I'll give them read access. The exchange rate cube, they can write, that's fine, they can update an exchange rate, and they can update the plan and the plan item detail. So the access privileges we have here is none, they don't see the cube, they don't know it exists, they can't do anything with it. Read, they can read the cube, they see it, but they can't change anything in it. Write, they can make changes to data in that cube. Now you'd think this is kind of the end, but notice there's 3 more states of higher privilege than that. Reserve lets someone reserve a cube in the sense that they are the only one that's allowed to make a change in that cube. Everyone else is locked out. Lock is when you lock a cube, no data in that cube can be changed, even if someone has sufficient privileges to change it. If they have write access, once a cube is locked, it cannot be changed. So lock is, to use the analogy of a physical lock. Once it's locked, it doesn't matter what access people had before. They can't do anything until it's unlocked, until that state's changed. An administrator can override all these different security pieces. So just to give you an example of reserve and lock, let's look at a specific cube. So here I'm looking at our budget plan cube. I go to my security submenu. I can reserve or I can lock. If I were to reserve this, now I'm the only one that can make changes to it. I can also release it. So I'll release it. Now other folks can go in and make changes to it. Again, with the security, I can lock it. If anyone comes in and tries to do anything, they can't do anything. I can't even go and reserve or release anymore, even though I had privileges to do so. Once it's locked, the only thing that can be done is unlock. And once it's unlocked, I can come back and reserve or lock and make changes as long as I have sufficient privileges to do so. So before we looked at cubes, this is a listing of cubes. Now, what if we look at a cell security cube? So creating a cell security cube creates a cube where you can get very, very specific, down to specific individual intersections to say, this intersection is read, write, none. This intersection is different with read, write, or none. I don't recommend using that. Try to avoid it where you can if there's a performance hit. But no matter what your controls are required for your business process, the tool can support very, very detailed and very granular control. Now let's look at, so far cubes we're talking about data. So if I double click on a cube, this is data here. So there's plan source and the data is all blank for right now, but you can see we're talking about a cube of data. Now to switch gears, if we look at dimensions, think of dimensions as lists and hierarchies. So here if I right click on dimensions and I look at my list of dimensions, I can control for each of my dimensions along my rows what's the access that a particular group has. So here our budget viewer has read access to all of these dimensions. And I recommend read access is the most that folks would really need. Unless folks are going to be creating a new element, they don't need any more than read access. Now, that being said, a common example is in HR planning, you'll want to create new employees. So there's typically, you enter some information about a new hire or new positions being created, and you click a button and it's going to create a new employee for the purposes of the plan. Even in that case, because there's a process that runs that creates that, the user doesn't need permission to write in the dimension, they just need permission to run that process. So from a best practices perspective, you only give people access to run the process that updates a dimension. You don't need to give them access to write to a specific dimension. Now if we expand dimensions, we can now look at individual dimensions. So here we've got our planned business unit dimension. If I right click on this and I go to, yes, elements, security, assignments. So here we're looking at a specific dimension. So it looks very similar. All these security assignments views are very similar. Here we can actually select our dimension if we wanted to switch between this and another one. But we're seeing our groups down the rows. Oh no, pardon me, we're seeing our dimension element members down the row. So these are all of our business units. And actually it's quite common. You'll see there are groups set up that match the business units. That's quite common. Then you can have a group to say anyone that's in this business unit, they have access to that element. You can also have more generic names here, and you can control who has access to which items. So here, all of these folks have no access. So if there's any data anywhere saved against a business unit, anyone in this group won't be able to see it. Right in the middle here, this group 10200 has write access to element 10200. So anyone that's in that 10200 group, they can go in and they can see data that's there and they can make changes to it. But anyone in group 10200, they can't see any data for other business units, and they certainly can't change it. So that's dimensions. Replications are really just copies of a server. These can be handy for reporting purposes or maybe co-location. You want to have local copies of cubes in different office facilities. Processes. So when you right click on processes and you go to security assignments, here we get a list of all the processes down our rows, and we get a listing of all our groups along the columns, and you can control who has access to read a specific process. It really should say execute. That's really what it means. So right now, anyone that's a business viewer, they wouldn't be able to run any of these processes. If I pick this one and I say read, now anyone that's a business viewer can run the plan load ASCII actual ASCII process. And this is a grid itself, so I can select a range and I can say I want the whole line to be that. So I just select a range just like I would in Excel and then set the access privileges as appropriate. Again, and also for chores. There's no chores in this case, but chores would be the same thing. You decide which which groups can run which chores. So just going back to recap. We went through security, we talked about user group design and how we want to have group membership set up so that individual users are part of groups, and then groups and users are members of larger groups, with the largest group really capturing everyone. Once we've done our user group design, then we can talk about how to set the security layers within TM1. What capabilities should folks have access to? So we talked about these different capabilities. We can grant, deny, or blank access to these individual features. With respect to application, which menu folders or items can folks have read, admin, or none access? For cubes, we're talking about data points. We may want to have security cubes to help make it more easy to maintain. If we do need to go down to cell level security to control exactly which intersections people can interact with, we can do that. When it comes to dimensions, there's the object as a dimension. Can they see the whole dimension? Can they see that employee dimension, or they cannot see the employee dimension at all? And an element. Can they see specific items in the specific dimension? So we used an example of business units. So certain groups can only see or write to specific business unit elements. Processes, who can run a specific process. We also talked about replication and chores, but those are less important around security. Those are really just copies of things. So thank you for watching, and I hope this was helpful.